The champagne glass trembled slightly in my hand as I watched Margaret Wellington, my boss's wife, glide through the crowded launch party like she owned every inch of the downtown Chicago penthouse. Her diamond earrings caught the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and her perfectly manicured finger pointed directly at me. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that could freeze Lake Michigan in July. "This table is reserved for family only." The November wind rattled the window's 30 floors above the bustling streets, but the chill in the air had nothing on the ice in Margaret's eyes. I had been standing near the beautifully decorated head table, admiring the elegant centerpieces and the view of the Chicago River below, when she approached me with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her entire privileged life. Please subscribe to our channel to help us bring you more real stories like this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us. I should probably start from the beginning. My name is David Chen, and 6 months ago, I was just another face in the crowd at Wellington and Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious architectural firms. I had been working there for 3 years, putting in 60-hour weeks, staying late when everyone else went home to their families, and consistently delivering projects that exceeded client expectations. But despite my dedication and the praise I received from clients, I remained invisible to the upper management, just another worker bee in their corporate hive. The firm occupied 3 floors of a gleaming tower in the Loop, with marble floors that echoed with the sound of expensive Italian leather shoes and walls lined with awards and photographs of completed projects. My desk was in the bullpen area on the 23rd floor, surrounded by other junior architects who, like me, dreamed of someday having their names on the letterhead. The senior partners worked on the 25th floor, in corner offices with panoramic views of the city and Lake Michigan, a world that seemed as distant as the moon despite being just 2 floors above us. Every morning, I would arrive at the office by 7:30, coffee in hand from the small Vietnamese shop my parents owned in Chinatown, and dive into blueprints and CAD drawings. My colleagues would trickle in around 9, comparing stories about their weekend activities in Lincoln Park or their latest dating adventures on apps I barely had time to use. While they socialized over lunch at trendy restaurants in River North, I ate sandwiches at my desk, reviewing zoning regulations and building codes. The isolation wasn't entirely unwelcome. Growing up as the son of immigrants who spoke limited English, I had learned early that success required twice the effort and half the recognition. My parents had sacrificed everything to give me opportunities they never had, working 16-hour days in their small restaurant, saving every dollar they could spare for my education. The pressure to succeed wasn't just personal, it was generational, carrying the hopes and dreams of a family that had risked everything for the chance at a better life. The irony wasn't lost on me that I, the son of immigrants who had scraped together every penny to put me through Northwestern University, was being dismissed by a woman who had married into her wealth and had never worked a day in her life. Margaret Wellington had grown up in the Gold Coast, attended elite private schools like Francis Parker where the annual tuition exceeded my parents' combined income, and had spent her adult life organizing charity galas and country club events at prestigious venues like the Chicago Yacht Club and Union League Club. Her background was everything mine wasn't. While I had spent summers working construction jobs with my father to help pay for textbooks and supplies, she had summered in the Hamptons and Europe, posting Instagram photos from Santorini and the French Riviera. While I had eaten ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches to stretch my meal plan through college, she had enjoyed catered lunches at sorority events and weekend brunches at trendy spots in Lincoln Park. Her wedding to Robert, which I had heard described in reverent tones by the office staff, had been featured in Chicago Magazine. A lavish affair at the Four Seasons with 500 guests and a reception that cost more than most people's annual salaries. She looked at me that night like I was a server who had wandered away from the kitchen, someone who belonged in the background ensuring her comfort rather than sharing her spotlight. It was a look I had encountered before in client meetings where I was introduced as our talented young architect, rather than by name, in restaurants where servers assumed I was the translator rather than the customer, in academic conferences where people seemed surprised that I could discuss Frank Lloyd Wright and Louis Sullivan with the same fluency they took for granted in themselves. What Margaret didn't know, what nobody at that party knew except for my boss Robert Wellington and the senior partners, was that earlier that afternoon, I had been promoted to junior partner. The announcement wasn't scheduled to be made until the following Monday morning, but Robert had pulled me aside after the contracts were signed and told me I deserved to celebrate with the rest of the team. The promotion had been the culmination of months of negotiations, performance reviews, and what Robert had called the most impressive portfolio presentation in the firm's 40-year history. The path to partnership had been anything but straightforward. 3 months earlier, I had requested a meeting with Robert to discuss my future at the firm. Armed with client testimonials, project portfolios, and financial projections showing how my work had contributed to the company's bottom line, I had made my case for advancement. The conversation had taken place in his corner office with its panoramic view of Grant Park and Lake Michigan, the same office where I had first interviewed for the position 3 years earlier as a nervous recent graduate clutching a portfolio that represented 4 years of sleepless nights in architectural theory. Robert had listened carefully as I presented my achievements, occasionally asking pointed questions about specific projects or client relationships. He had been particularly interested in my work with the Community Advisory Board for the Millennium Project, a group of local residents and business owners who had initially been skeptical of any new development in their neighborhood. Through months of evening meetings in church basements and community centers, I had earned their trust by listening to their concerns and incorporating their feedback into the design. The result was a building that served not just its residents and commercial tenants, but the broader community through public spaces, local retail opportunities, and environmental improvements. He had even specifically invited me to sit at the partners' table, though he hadn't mentioned it to his wife. "David," he had said, his hand on my shoulder as we left his office that afternoon. "You've earned this recognition, and I want you to feel like the partner you now are. Tonight is about celebrating the Millennium Project, but it's also about celebrating you." The launch party was celebrating our firm's biggest contract in a decade, a 40-story mixed-use development that would reshape Chicago's skyline. The Millennium Project, as it came to be known, represented everything I had worked toward since graduating from Northwestern. I had been the lead architect on the project, working closely with city planners, environmental consultants, and community leaders to create something that would serve the city for generations. The project had consumed 18 months of my life, requiring me to master new sustainable building techniques, navigate complex zoning laws, and balance the competing interests of developers, city officials, and community activists. I had spent countless nights in my small studio apartment in Wicker Park, surrounded by sketches and models, reimagining how people could live and work in an urban environment. The design incorporated green spaces on every third floor, energy-efficient systems that would reduce the building's carbon footprint by 40%, and affordable housing units seamlessly integrated with luxury condominiums. My dedication to the project had come at a personal cost. Sarah, who was completing her surgical residency at Northwestern Memorial, often fell asleep alone while I worked late into the night. We had planned weekend trips to Wisconsin or Michigan that were canceled when client meetings ran long or when inspiration struck and I needed to capture an idea before it disappeared. She never complained, understanding that this project could define my career, but I could see the strain in her eyes when I missed another dinner or canceled another date. The recognition from the Chicago Architecture Foundation had been unexpected but validating. They had featured my design in their monthly publication, praising its innovative approach to urban sustainability and community integration. The article included a photograph of me standing in front of the scale model, looking more confident than I felt, with a quote about architecture's responsibility to serve not just clients but entire communities. My parents had framed the article and hung it proudly in their restaurant, showing it to customers who probably couldn't read the English text but understood the significance of seeing their son's name in print. Standing there in my best suit, which I had bought specifically for the occasion despite the strain it put on my budget, I felt the familiar weight of being underestimated. The navy blue Tom Ford suit had cost me 3 months of careful saving, purchased at a Nordstrom Rack outlet during their end-of-season sale. Even on sale, it represented more money than I had ever spent on a single piece of clothing, but I had recognized it as an investment in my professional image. The tailoring had required additional alterations to achieve the perfect fit, and when I looked in the mirror that evening, I had seen not just a young architect, but a future partner. It was the same feeling I had experienced throughout my career, the same look I had seen in the eyes of clients who were surprised when I walked into meetings instead of someone who looked more like what they expected. There had been the real estate developer who had asked if I was the intern taking notes, the city planning commissioner who had directed all his questions to my white colleague despite my role as lead architect, and the construction foreman who had assumed I was a translator for the real architect who would arrive later. Each instance had been a small cut, barely noticeable individually but collectively forming a pattern of doubt and diminishment that I had learned to navigate with patience and professionalism. I had developed strategies for these encounters, ways of establishing my credibility quickly and definitively without appearing defensive or confrontational. I would lead with technical expertise, referencing specific building codes or architectural principles that demonstrated my knowledge. I would share client testimonials and project outcomes that spoke to my competence. I would dress impeccably, speak confidently, and never give anyone a reason to question my qualifications beyond the color of my skin or the sound of my name. But tonight was different. Tonight, I had something they didn't know about, something that would fundamentally change the dynamics of any conversation. Tonight, I was no longer David Chun, junior architect hoping for recognition. I was David Chun, partner, with all the authority and respect that title commanded. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I was specifically invited to sit at this table." The words came out more diplomatically than I felt, a skill I had learned from years of navigating corporate politics and client relationships. Margaret's laugh was sharp and dismissive, the kind of sound that could cut glass. "I highly doubt that," she said, adjusting her pearl necklace with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been challenged. "This table is for partners and their families. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable with the other employees over there." She gestured toward a cluster of tables near the bar, where my former colleagues were enjoying their drinks and appetizers, oblivious to the drama unfolding across the room. The party continued around us, a symphony of clinking glasses, polite laughter, and conversations about real estate markets and vacation homes in the Hamptons. The smell of expensive perfume mixed with the aroma of catered hors d'oeuvres, and servers in crisp white shirts weaved between guests carrying silver trays of champagne. Outside the windows, Chicago sparkled in the darkness, the city's lights reflecting off the river like scattered diamonds. I could have walked away. Every instinct I had developed from years of workplace politics told me to smile, nod politely, and retreat to avoid causing a scene. My parents had taught me the value of harmony, of not making waves, of succeeding through quiet persistence rather than confrontation. "Keep your head down and work hard," my father had always said, his philosophy shaped by decades of navigating American society as a Chinese immigrant who spoke English with a heavy accent. "Let your work speak for itself." But something about the way Margaret looked at me, something about the casual cruelty in her dismissal, made me realize that this was about more than just a seating arrangement. This was about respect, about recognition, and about all the times I had been made to feel like I didn't belong in spaces I had earned the right to occupy. This was about the lunch meetings where I had been excluded from important conversations, the client dinners where I had been introduced as our associate, while less experienced white colleagues were presented by name and title, the firm retreats where I had been assigned to share accommodations with support staff rather than other architects. I thought about the countless hours I had spent perfecting my presentations, knowing that any mistake would be amplified and remembered longer than similar errors from my colleagues. I remembered the extra research I did before every client meeting, the way I rehearsed answers to questions that might never be asked, the careful attention I paid to every detail of my appearance and communication style. While others could rely on natural charisma or family connections to advance their careers, I had understood from the beginning that excellence would be my only currency. The weight of representing not just myself but everyone who looked like me in professional spaces had been both motivating and exhausting. I carried the hopes of my parents, who had sacrificed their own comfort and security to give me opportunities they never had. I carried the expectations of my extended family, who saw my success as validation of their decision to immigrate to America. I carried the responsibility of being a positive example for other young Asian American professionals who might follow in my footsteps. "You know what, Margaret?" I said, using her first name deliberately, watching as her eyes widened slightly at my familiarity. "You're absolutely right. This table is for partners and their families." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the partnership agreement I had signed that afternoon, the ink barely dry on my signature. "And as of today, I am a partner." The conversation at nearby tables began to quiet as people sensed the tension in the air. Margaret's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that might have been embarrassment. She reached for the document with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the legal text and the signatures at the bottom. Robert Wellington chose that moment to approach our little corner of the party, his face flushed with champagne and success. He was a tall man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from decades of closing million-dollar deals. "David," he called out, his voice carrying across the party chatter. "I see you've met my wife, Margaret. I hope she's been welcoming." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face had gone pale, her usual composure cracking like a facade in an earthquake. She looked from her husband to me and back again, clearly trying to process what was happening. The partnership agreement trembled in her hands like a leaf in the Chicago wind. "Robert," she said, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "You didn't tell me that that he had been promoted." The words came out slowly, carefully, as if she was walking across thin ice. Robert's smile faltered as he looked between us, clearly sensing that something had gone wrong. The champagne in his glass caught the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead, and I could see his mind working to understand the tension that had settled over our little corner of the party. "I wanted it to be a surprise for the Monday announcement," he said, his eyes moving from his wife's pale face to the contract in her hands. "David has been instrumental in landing the Millennium Project. He deserves to be here at this table with the rest of the partners." The weight of the moment settled over the three of us like a heavy blanket. Other guests had begun to notice the tension, their conversations growing quieter as they strained to hear what was happening. I could see my former colleagues at their tables, looking over with curiosity and concern. James Morrison, a fellow junior architect who had started the same week as me, raised his eyebrows in a silent question. Lisa Park from the interior design team had stopped mid-sentence in her conversation and was watching with obvious interest. Margaret's carefully constructed social armor was beginning to crack. She had built her identity around being the perfect corporate wife, the woman who knew exactly who belonged where and when. Her charity work, her country club memberships, her position on various cultural boards, all of it was predicated on her ability to navigate social hierarchies with grace and precision. But now, standing in front of her husband's newest partner, she had made a mistake that could not be easily undone. Sarah, who had arrived separately from her job at the hospital, was making her way through the crowd toward us, her dark eyes filled with worry. She moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to handling emergencies, her black dress a stark contrast to the pastel colors favored by most of the other women at the party. Even from across the room, I could see her reading the situation, her medical training helping her assess the emotional temperature of our little drama. Margaret handed the contract back to me with trembling fingers, her diamond rings catching the light as she tried to maintain some semblance of dignity. I apologize," she said, the words coming out stiff and uncomfortable. "I didn't realize Robert hadn't mentioned." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. But I wasn't quite ready to let her off the hook. 3 years of being overlooked, 3 years of having my ideas questioned more harshly than my colleagues. 3 years of being treated like I was lucky to be in the room instead of recognizing that the room was lucky to have me. All of that frustration and determination had led to this moment. "No harm done," I said, pulling out the chair at the head of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the senior partner. "After all, you were right. This table is for family. And as of today, I'm part of the Wellington and Associates family." I sat down slowly, deliberately, making myself comfortable in the leather chair while Margaret stood frozen beside the table. Robert's face broke into a genuine smile, the tension easing from his shoulders as he realized what I was doing. "That's right," he said, clapping me on the shoulder with the kind of paternal pride I had rarely seen from him. "David, welcome to the partnership. You've more than earned it." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations, handshakes, and conversations about future projects. Word of my promotion spread through the gathering like wildfire, carried by whispers and meaningful glances from table to table. Suddenly I found myself surrounded by colleagues who had barely acknowledged me the week before, people whose names I knew from the company directory, but who had never bothered to learn mine. Thomas Bradley, one of the senior associates who had never returned my emails promptly, appeared at my elbow with a fresh drink and a smile that seemed genuine. "David, congratulations on the partnership," he said, his tone warm and respectful in a way it had never been before. "I've been following your work on the Millennium Project. Brilliant stuff, really brilliant." The same man who had questioned my design choices in meetings just months earlier was now singing my praises to anyone who would listen. Jennifer Walsh from the business development team, who had previously treated me like an inconvenience when I needed client contact information, now hung on my every word as I described my vision for the firm's future. She laughed at my observations about Chicago's architectural landscape, nodding enthusiastically when I mentioned possible expansion into sustainable residential projects. The transformation was both gratifying and unsettling, a reminder of how quickly professional relationships could shift based on perceived status and influence. Margaret disappeared shortly after our confrontation, claiming a headache that fooled no one who had witnessed our exchange. But not before I caught her whispering urgently into her phone in the corner of the party, her back turned to the crowd, her free hand gesturing emphatically. I wondered if she was calling a friend, a therapist, or perhaps her mother, seeking comfort or advice on how to handle the social misstep that would undoubtedly become gossip at her next country club luncheon. The partners' table, which had seemed so intimidating just hours earlier, now felt like home. Senior partner William Hayes, a distinguished man in his 70s who had founded the firm with Robert's father, regaled us with stories of Chicago's architectural evolution over the past 50 years. He spoke of projects that had transformed neighborhoods, of buildings that had become landmarks, and of the responsibility that came with shaping a city's future. His words carried weight, not just because of his experience, but because he was speaking to me as an equal, a fellow guardian of the city's architectural heritage. Sarah found me during a quiet moment on the terrace, where I had stepped out to get some air and process everything that had happened. The November night was crisp and clear. The city spread out below us like a constellation of dreams and possibilities. The Chicago River curved through the downtown core like a dark ribbon, its surface reflecting the lights from the bridges and buildings that lined its banks. In the distance, I could see the construction cranes working on other projects, the constant evolution of a city that never stopped growing and changing. She wrapped her arms around me from behind, her warmth cutting through the cold that had begun to seep through my suit jacket. Sarah understood the significance of what had happened better than anyone else at the party. As one of the few Latina residents in her surgery program at Northwestern Memorial, she had fought her own battles against assumptions and prejudices that questioned whether someone with her background belonged in an operating room making life-and-death decisions. "I heard what happened with Margaret," she said, her voice soft against my ear, her breath visible in the cold air. "Lisa Park told me she watched the whole thing unfold. She said Margaret's face went completely white when she realized who you were." Sarah had arrived at the party directly from a 12-hour shift in the emergency room, trading her scrubs for the black cocktail dress she kept in her hospital locker for occasions like this. Even after the exhaustion of saving lives, she had come to support me on what we both knew was an important night for my career. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself," she continued, tightening her arms around me. "I know how hard that was, especially with everyone watching, but you didn't back down, and you didn't let her make you feel small." "I almost walked away," I admitted, leaning back against her warmth and strength. For a moment there, I was ready to just smile and nod and go sit with everyone else. But then I thought about all the times I had done that before, all the times I had made myself smaller to make other people more comfortable. The honesty felt liberating, admitting to the moments of doubt and the temptation to choose the path of least resistance. She squeezed me tighter. "But you didn't walk away. You stood your ground and claimed your place at that table. Literally and figuratively." Looking back now, 6 months later, I can see how that moment at the launch party was a turning point not just in my career, but in how I viewed myself and my place in the world. The partnership has opened doors I never imagined possible, creating opportunities that extend far beyond the walls of Wellington and Associates. I've been invited to speak at architecture conferences in New York and Los Angeles, sharing my insights on sustainable urban development with audiences of seasoned professionals who listen with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. The recognition has been both humbling and empowering. Last month, Architectural Digest featured the Millennium Project in their annual review of innovative urban design, with a full-page photograph of my scale model and a quote about the future of environmentally conscious architecture. The article described my approach as revolutionary yet practical, visionary yet grounded in community needs. Seeing those words in print, knowing that architects around the world would read them, filled me with a pride that was different from any I had experienced before. The speaking engagements have taken me to cities I had only read about in design magazines. In Portland, I discussed sustainable building materials with environmental engineers who were pushing the boundaries of what was possible with recycled and renewable resources. In Austin, I participated in a panel on affordable housing, sharing strategies for integrating low-income units into luxury developments without creating visible economic segregation. Each conversation, each conference, has expanded my understanding of architecture's role in addressing social and environmental challenges. More importantly, these opportunities have connected me with other architects who share similar backgrounds and struggles. Maria Rodriguez, a Latina architect from Los Angeles who had faced her own battles with workplace discrimination, became a mentor and friend. During a late-night conversation at a conference in Denver, she shared stories that mirrored my own experiences of being underestimated, of having ideas questioned more harshly than those of white male colleagues, of constantly proving that we belonged in rooms where we were often the only faces of color. The difference, she told me over coffee as the sun rose over the Rocky Mountains, is that now we're not just trying to get into those rooms. We're creating our own rooms, setting our own tables, and deciding who gets invited. Her words resonated deeply, reminding me that success wasn't just about achieving personal goals, but about using that success to create opportunities for others who faced similar challenges. Margaret and I have maintained a polite, professional distance since that night, our interactions limited to brief acknowledgments at firm functions and charity events. The tension from our confrontation has evolved into something more complex, a mutual understanding that we had both learned something important about assumptions, privilege, and the power of standing up for oneself. She attends firm functions when required, but she no longer organizes the seating arrangements, leaving those details to the event coordinators who base their decisions on professional hierarchy rather than personal preference. Robert has mentioned that she's become more involved in her charity work, focusing particularly on organizations that provide scholarships for first-generation college students and mentorship programs for young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds. Perhaps our confrontation taught her something about the barriers that exist for people like me, or perhaps she simply prefers to channel her energy into causes where she can make a positive impact rather than risk another awkward encounter. Either way, her increased philanthropy has created opportunities for students who might otherwise struggle to access higher education or professional networks. During a recent firm retreat in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, she approached me during a quiet moment on the resort's terrace, where I was reviewing notes from a client presentation. The autumn leaves were reflecting gold and crimson in the lake's surface, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter. "David," she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it, "I wanted you to know that I've been thinking about our conversation at the launch party." I looked up from my papers, surprised by her approach and the vulnerability in her tone. She had traded her usual designer dress for casual clothes that made her seem more approachable, more human. "I realized that night that I had made assumptions about you, about your role in the company, and I wanted to apologize for that. More than apologize, actually. I wanted to thank you." The unexpected turn in our conversation caught me off guard. "Thank me?" She sat down in the chair across from me, looking out over the lake where sailboats drifted in the afternoon breeze. "You could have walked away that night, or let me embarrass myself further. Instead, you stood your ground with dignity and helped me see something I needed to see about myself. That's not an easy gift to receive, but it's an important one. The other partners have embraced me as a colleague and equal, involving me in strategic decisions and seeking my input on everything from client relationships to office culture. The transition hasn't always been smooth. There have been moments of imposter syndrome and self-doubt, but I've learned to trust in my abilities and the value I bring to the firm." My parents visited the office last week, their first time seeing my new corner office with its view of the lake and my name etched in gold letters on the glass door. The visit had been planned for weeks, a celebration of my partnership that had taken on additional significance as they prepared to retire and sell the restaurant that had supported our family for over 2 decades. They had dressed in their finest clothes, my mother wearing the pearl necklace I had given her for her 60th birthday, my father in the navy suit he had worn to my Northwestern graduation. Walking through the marble lobby of our building, past the security desk and into the elevator that would take us to the 25th floor, I watched their faces as they took in the opulence of the environment where I now worked. The lobby featured a rotating display of the firm's most prestigious projects, including a large-scale model of the Millennium Development that bore a small plaque crediting me as the lead architect. My mother stopped in front of the display for several minutes, reading the description in English with the careful concentration she had always brought to understanding the language that had never come naturally to her. My father, who had worked construction jobs to put me through school, stood quietly by the window of my office for a long time. His calloused hands pressed against the glass as he looked out over the city his labor had helped build. From my window, we could see several buildings where he had worked over the years, steel and concrete structures that had employed him when architecture was something I only dreamed about in textbooks and late-night sketching sessions. When he turned around, there were tears in his eyes, the first time I had seen him cry since my grandfather's funeral when I was 12. "We are proud of you, son," he said in Mandarin, his voice thick with emotion that transcended the language barrier. "You have honored our family and justified every sacrifice we made." The weight of his words, spoken in the language of our heritage in the space that represented my American success, created a bridge between the two worlds I had always navigated. That launch party taught me that sometimes the most important battles we fight are not against external obstacles, but against our own willingness to accept less than we deserve. For years, I had convinced myself that working hard and keeping my head down would be enough, that eventually merit would speak for itself. But merit without advocacy is often invisible, and talent without confidence is easily overlooked. The lesson I learned that night, standing next to Margaret Wellington with my partnership agreement in my hand, was that respect is not something that is given freely. It must be claimed, defended, and maintained. It requires us to advocate for ourselves, to refuse to be diminished, and to insist on our right to occupy the spaces we have earned. Today, when young architects join our firm, especially those from backgrounds similar to mine, I make sure they know they belong at every table, in every meeting, and in every conversation about their future. I share my story not as a tale of triumph over adversity, but as a reminder that our worth is not determined by other people's ability to recognize it. The head of that table, the seat I claimed that November night, was never really about the furniture or the view or the prestige. It was about refusing to accept someone else's definition of where I belonged and insisting on my right to define that for myself. It was about understanding that sometimes, when someone tells you a table is for family only, the most powerful response is to pull up a chair and remind them that you are exactly where you belong. The Chicago skyline continues to evolve, with new buildings rising and old ones being transformed, just like the city's people and their stories. And somewhere in that skyline, when the Millennium Project is completed next year, there will be a building that exists because a young architect refused to accept that he didn't belong at the table where decisions were made. That night, Margaret Wellington thought she was putting me in my place. Instead, she helped me find it.